March 9, 1968, Phuoc Vinh Province, South Vietnam. The sun rose into a haze of orange and smoke. The jungle was quiet, but only for a moment. Jack H. Jacobs, a young first lieutenant with the 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry, adjusted the strap of his helmet. The mission was routine, they said, a sweep and clear operation. Nothing unexpected. Then came the ambush. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. Explosions shattered the calm. Chaos descended in seconds. Bullets hissed overhead. Men screamed. Others didn't. Radio calls turned to static. The entire company staggered under the surprise assault from a heavily armed Viet Cong force. Jacobs was a forward observer. His job wasn't to fight, but to coordinate air and artillery support. But when he looked around, there was no chain of command. Officers were down. Soldiers were bleeding out in the mud. Panic began to spread like fire. Then something in him snapped into place. With blood already streaming from head wounds caused by shrapnel, Jacobs grabbed a rifle, crawled under fire, and began dragging wounded soldiers to safety. Over and over. Again, through open ground, with machine guns tearing through the brush around him, he returned. Not once, not twice, dozens of times. That day, with his own vision blurred by blood, his breath short, and death pressing in on every side, Jacobs didn't retreat. He became the reason others lived, but this is only the beginning of his story. Because what happened that day in Vietnam was not just a moment of valor. It was the spark that ignited a life defined by courage, service, and a deep, lifelong burden. The sun was already burning overhead as Jack stepped into the rice paddies of Vietnam. Sweat clung to his skin. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made your heartbeat feel like thunder in your ears. As a young first lieutenant and advisor to a South Vietnamese infantry battalion, Jack knew his role was more than military. It was personal. He wasn't just leading, he was protecting lives. The terrain was unforgiving. Dense jungle to one side, open paddies to the other. Every step could hide a mine, every bush a sniper. The men under his command were brave but nervous, and so was he. No amount of training could prepare someone for the deafening silence before the first shot. Then chaos. Automatic fire erupted from the tree line. Explosions tore through the air. The battalion was ambushed. Soldiers fell. Screams followed. In seconds, the calm became carnage. Jack didn't flinch. With bullets slicing past him, he ran to the front. He found his commander down, bleeding, unconscious. Without hesitation, Jack dragged him to cover, then returned. Again and again. Through smoke and fire, he carried the wounded. He directed fire. He called in support. He shielded lives with his own body. One moment he was a soldier. The next, he was a lifeline. That day, he would rescue 13 men. Many of them wouldn't have survived without him. And yet, when the gunfire finally stopped and the field was quiet again, Jack didn't think of medals. He thought of the faces he couldn't save. It was his first taste of combat, and it would stay with him forever. March 9th, 1968. The air was heavy and damp as Jack H. Jacobs stepped into the rice paddies of Quien Phong Province, South Vietnam. His unit was part of an operation to flush out Viet Cong forces hidden among the dense vegetation and flooded fields. What began as a routine sweep turned into chaos within minutes. Without warning, a hail of gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets sliced through the air. Explosions shook the earth. The platoon was ambushed, trapped in the open with nowhere to hide. Soldiers fell, wounded or dead, their cries swallowed by the roar of combat. Jacobs, though temporarily blinded by shrapnel and bleeding from head wounds, refused to back down. He could barely see, but he could still think and act with incredible resolve. He crawled through the muddy water toward the wounded. One by one, he dragged his fellow soldiers to safety, shielding them with his own body as enemy fire rained down. He administered first aid, picked up their weapons, and returned fire when needed. The chaos didn't end. At one point, despite his injuries, Jacobs led a counterattack, not out of strategy, but out of necessity. The enemy was closing in, and there was no time to wait. He charged forward, yelling, firing, pulling comrades along with him. His courage ignited theirs. He went back into the fire again, and again. Over 24 men owe their lives to the man who could barely walk, barely see, but who refused to let them die. That day, Jack Jacobs didn't just fight the enemy. He fought fear, pain, limitations, and he won. The war didn't end when Jack H. Jacobs returned home. In many ways, it was only just beginning. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions in Vietnam, dragging wounded soldiers to safety under fire, refusing to abandon the battlefield even after being seriously injured himself. But when the ceremony was over and the uniform came off, Jack found himself staring at a nation deeply divided, unsure how to treat its heroes. Unlike many veterans who faded into anonymity, Jack made a choice. He wouldn't disappear. The Medal of Honor wasn't just a decoration to him, it was a responsibility. He began speaking publicly, not just about the battle that made him famous, but about the invisible wounds veterans carried home. He visited hospitals, spoke at schools, and became a voice in the media, determined to give a face to sacrifice. But behind the appearances and the applause, he still bore the weight of memory. The faces, the fire, the screams. There were nights he couldn't sleep, days he couldn't focus, but Jack refused to let the pain paralyze him. He leaned into it. He used it. He saw the medal as a shield, not just for himself, but for those who didn't make it back. For every man he couldn't save, he tried to honor them by living with purpose, and as he found his voice, the mission changed. From soldier to witness, from survivor to advocate. Because Jack knew one truth too well: the greatest battles are often fought long after the gunfire ends. Bullets zipped past him. Explosions shook the trees. The air was thick with smoke and screams. Jack Jacobs had no choice. His commanding officer had just been wounded. The platoon was in disarray, pinned down by relentless enemy fire, and chaos had swallowed the battlefield. Whole, he was already bleeding from his head and arms, his vision blurred by blood and dust, but there was no time to hesitate. He pulled his officer to safety, dragging him through the grass as gunfire ripped through the jungle. And then he went back, not once, not twice, over and over again. With each trip he braved machine gun nests, mortars, and sniper fire. Each time he returned carrying another wounded soldier across his shoulders. Some were unconscious, others moaned in pain. But all of them were alive because Jack refused to leave them behind. He fought his way to a small clearing where he set up a one-man medical post. With the enemy still firing, he applied tourniquets, administered morphine, and reassured men who believed they wouldn't make it home. Every life mattered. Every second counted. He refused evacuation. Even as his body screamed in pain, he crawled back again into the kill zone, each movement more difficult than the last. He fought not for medals, but for his brothers, for those who still breathed. By the time reinforcements arrived, Jack had saved over a dozen lives. He didn't think of himself as a hero, but those who watched him walk through fire again and again knew otherwise. The battlefield quieted, but the war inside never did. Jack H. Jacobs returned from Vietnam with medals on his chest and a 1,000-yard stare in his eyes. The world saw a hero, a man who had carried the wounded through flames and chaos. But Jack knew what the world couldn't see: the weight of memory, the silence of trauma, the faces that would never leave his mind. He struggled to sleep. His dreams were riddled with gunfire, with screams, with moments he wished he could forget but couldn't. He tried to move on, to work, to build a life, to find peace. But peace doesn't come easy for a man who's lived through hell. Like many veterans, Jack found that reintegration was its own battlefield. Civilians didn't understand what he'd been through. The questions they asked felt shallow. The praise felt distant. Some friends drifted away, not knowing what to say. Others tried to help, but didn't know how. But Jack was a fighter, not just in war, but in life. He sought help. He educated himself. He began to speak about what others kept buried. He knew the silence could be deadly, and so he turned his pain into purpose. He became an advocate, a mentor, a voice for those who felt voiceless. He didn't pretend to have all the answers, but he had walked through the fire, and he refused to let others walk it alone. The medals he wore were no longer just reminders of war. They were symbols of responsibility, a call to make sure that sacrifice is honored not just in ceremony, but in action. Because for Jack H. Jacobs, the war never truly ended, but neither did his fight to bring light into the darkness it left behind. The physical injuries were brutal: shrapnel in his arms, burns across his hands, a limp that never fully faded. But those were the wounds people could see, the ones they could understand, the ones that earned medals. The other wounds, the ones that stayed hidden, ran deeper. After returning to the United States, Jack H. Jacobs was hailed as a hero. News outlets called him fearless. Fellow soldiers praised his actions. Military ceremonies celebrated him. But when the lights dimmed and the room emptied, something inside him remained unsettled. He had survived. He had saved lives, but he had also seen death, felt it brush past him, heard the cries of the men he couldn't reach in time, smelled the burning, watched the blood soak into the ground. Sleep didn't come easily. Loud noises made him flinch. The memories, vivid and merciless, looped in his mind like a film he couldn't pause. He didn't talk about it, not with his family, not even with himself. He buried it. That's what soldiers were taught to do. But Jack also knew silence could be a battlefield, so he started speaking, quietly at first, at schools, veterans centers, military gatherings. He shared what the war had done, not just to his body, but to his spirit. He spoke of duty, sacrifice, but also trauma, guilt, and healing. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted awareness. Over time, his voice grew stronger. Jack realized that telling his story wasn't just about remembering. It was about teaching, about making sure future generations understood the full weight of war, not just the glory, but the scars it leaves behind. And through that, he found purpose again, not as a soldier carrying bodies through fire, but as a man carrying truth through silence. Jack H. Jacobs never sought recognition. Even after receiving the Medal of Honor, he carried himself with humility, often downplaying what he had done. But the weight of what he had lived through, what he had survived, never truly left him. After leaving the battlefield, Jack continued to serve, not with weapons, but with words. He became a mentor, a teacher, a voice for those who had none. He shared his story not to be celebrated, but to remind others of what sacrifice looks like, what leadership truly demands, and what war never shows. On the surface, he stood in classrooms and boardrooms, television studios and veterans' halls, always returning to the same message: real heroes are those who carry others through fire and never ask to be called one. For Jack, the war never ended. It simply changed forms. The memories remained, as did the responsibility to ensure that those who came after him would never feel forgotten. He turned his pain into purpose. His name may be carved into medals and spoken in ceremonies, but his real legacy lives in every soldier who chooses courage, in every act of selflessness on and off the battlefield, in every life that learns from his example. Jack H. Jacobs didn't just carry lives through fire, he carried hope through darkness. And with each step forward, he left behind not just footprints, but light. If the story of Jack H. Jacobs moved you, let it live beyond this screen. Share your thoughts in the comments and let others know that true courage doesn't always come with applause. It often walks through fire, carrying others. Like this video to honor Jack and the many veterans whose bravery shaped history. And don't forget to subscribe to Héroes de Guerra for more true stories of strength, sacrifice, and silent heroism.